Mary Trump, welcome to Primetime.
Thanks, Chris. It's great to be here.
Appreciate you taking the opportunity. I was going to start the interview by saying you were in pretty rare air. You had written something about the president that is certainly critical in certain aspects, and he hadn't said anything back. That just changed moments ago. He lumped you in with John Bolton, referring to what he calls the Book of the Month Club. He calls John Bolton a lowlife and a dummy. You do well by comparison. He comes to you second. He says, next up is Mary Trump, a seldom seen niece who knows little about me, says untruthful things about my wonderful parents who couldn't stand her and me, and violated her NDA, non-disclosure agreement. She also broke the law by giving out my tax returns. She's a mess. Response.
It's hard to know where to start. So let's start with the easy stuff first. A court ruled that I did not break the NDA, which is why I'm able to be here with you this evening. I never had Donald's tax returns in my possession, so I could not have released them to anybody. The documents I had were legally mine, which I obtained through discovery during the lawsuit I was engaged in with my family almost 20 years ago, and were predominantly my grandfather's tax documents and his business's tax documents. As for being seldom seen, I guess for Donald, that is one of the biggest insults you can hurl at somebody, but I've been fine with it.
Why is it an insult for him?
I think he thinks being seen is something he values. So I'm not entirely sure.
Do you know him? Have you been around him enough to form an opinion?
Of course, he was my dad's younger brother. We spent huge amounts of time in the house growing up, and Donald was there frequently. My Uncle Rob was there frequently. My aunts. So, of course, we spent every holiday together, pretty much until my grandfather died in 1999.
And after that?
You know, it's hard to stay together as a family after you've been disinherited and there's been a fairly bitter lawsuit. So, yes, since 1999. There's been very little contact, but, before then, he hired me to write his book for him, his second book. So that doesn't exactly square with my not being part of the family or my not having any knowledge of him. And as for my grandparents not being able to stand me, I think if that were true, it would say more about them than it says about me. But certainly in the case of my grandmother, it was not true. We were very close. I really loved her and believed that she loved me. And, my grandfather, I don't think was really had real positive feelings towards anybody except perhaps Donald.
The idea of she's a mess, other than trying to discredit the book and your credibility, what do you think he's referring to?
I think it's just an attack he hurls predominantly, I think, about women. And honestly, I'm in very good company. I believe he's said the same thing about Nancy Pelosi. And I'm fine with that.
Let's take one step sideways. Do you think, knowing your uncle the way you do you think he believes that you violated the NDA? Do you think he believes the things that he says? Or do you think that he says what he thinks is effective?
Interestingly, I think both things can be true at the same time. In this particular case, I honestly don't know, because very often what he says and or believes depends upon who has his ear in the moment.
What does that mean?
That means that if somebody close to him is spinning facts in a way that are easier for him to take or believe, then he will. I mean, a judge made a ruling. So if he's not believing the judge's decision, then clearly he's listening to somebody else.
Is it really that simple? A look inside how he was before he was president with somebody who was right there, Mary Trump. The president claims He knows little about her, but she's got plenty of examples and firsthand experiences about him. Next. We're back now one-on-one with Mary Trump, the president's niece. Inside the family, was he known as the smart one?
No, not at all.
How was he regarded in your experience when he wasn't around, I guess, more often than when he was?
You know, growing up, it's very difficult to gauge things like that because, it's my dad, it's my aunts, my uncles, my grandparents. So there wouldn't have been any discussion along those lines when I was a kid. What I did know with absolute certainty was that he was absolutely the preferred child. And because of that, and because of how he was presented to the world and within the family, it was very easy to believe that he was incredibly successful on his own. So it wasn't until much later that I was able to tease out the truth of, the fact that he really had been supported by my grandfather throughout.
You answered quickly when I said, was he known as the smart one? You said no. Why such a quick assessment?
Well, he hasn't changed much. And I think, if we only knew him now and extrapolated backwards, it would be pretty obvious. He's not intellectual. He doesn't seem to have any interest in learning. He has no intellectual curiosity. And being well educated does not make you well informed.
And when you were a kid and growing up, what do you remember about him in terms of bearing and how he was with you and others?
He was supremely confident. He didn't have any reason not to be, really. He could be dismissive, he wasn't very interested in hanging out with us a lot. We would play ball in the backyard once in a while, but he had other more important things to attend to. I mean, we got along, and he wouldn't have hired me to write his book if he had hated me or thought badly of me. So, but I think it is fair to say that we didn't really spend time together until I was working for him when I was in my 20s.
A couple of things that jumped out at me and look in the book. It always matters to me how somebody begins a book, not with their material, but often what they have in a preface and a quote or something that suggests direction. You have a quote from Les Mis about when a soul is in darkness, sin may come, but the problem isn't the person who sins, it's the person who created the darkness.
Yeah.
What does that quote mean to you in the context of you and writing this book?
Well, I think the reason I decided to use that quote ultimately was because it worked on two very important levels that fit in really nicely with what I was trying to convey in the book. So in the context of my family, the person creating the darkness was my grandfather. And the person creating the sins in that darkness would have been Donald. Now we're in a situation where it's Donald and his enablers creating the darkness, and the rest of us are left to stumble around as best we can. And sometimes, doing the wrong things because we're not being led. We're not, the truth is not being leveled at us. So it could be something as simple as wearing a mask, or as egregious as committing hate crimes, which seem to be sadly endorsed to some degree by this administration.